as the continued attack on the family and children, and yet we have a church right now at large, and many well-meaning people who think they cannot speak out on the issue of LGBTQ because it would be unkind. And really what's driving this is that most of these people, and if I were to ask many of you by raise of hand, if you know somebody who is gay or have a family member that's gay, many of you would raise your hand. And this is the problem, even in the church, is the church members have so many connections, and so the pushback against the leadership is a fear-mongering, labeling of our leaders as being bigots and coward or homophobes and unkind. And we need to rise up in courage. I mean, those words are nothing. We had these founding forefathers that are willing to pick up arms and shed their own blood over something that was actually, when you look at the grand scheme of things, even a lot less to be able to bring in liberty. And now we have this fight that is actually going to destroy the fabric of our country. Folks, don't miss this as something that's benign. This is actually huge, because LGBTQ plus being normalized at the level of race and gender would bring so much destruction at the economic level. You know, these businesses that are signing on to this is going to bring destruction in so many levels. Healthcare, there's so many avenues by which this is destructive. But it is an assault on the family. I was meeting with a pastor and his family. His son yesterday out in California, they're getting ready to have a family vacation. And the reality is that the son, who's married to a man, has announced that the 4 grandsons would be hearing from him that his lifestyle is a good and loving lifestyle, and that the parents and the grandparents are the ones that are evil bigots. And this is going on across all families. We're at Matthew 10, and this is my little, part for today. But you need to hear this, because I've been speaking about this the last few weeks. And this is so outrageous, people can't even hardly believe this is happening. So we're at Matthew 10, and that is, members of your own household are going to start accusing you and persecuting you. And members of the church will do so as well. But just look at this clip, and I'll finish up.
You have written, we have discussed some seriously crazy stories out of the public school. This one might be the worst yet. We have a school administrator in California actually arguing that we need to, and they are, even as we speak, teaching pedophilia to children as just another option for sexual orientation. Give us the story.
This concerned mother asked the assistant superintendent of curricula in the Brea Olinda School District in California why they were teaching children pedophilia and normalizing anal sex. And you would expect the administrator, the assistant superintendent, to say, "Oh my goodness, that's horrible. Where did you get such an idea? We would never do something like that." But instead, what she says is, well, this is a sexual orientation that has occurred, and so it's, quote, really important to teach the children about this, and they are.
Answer me why you're teaching pedophilia in school at ninth graders.
Teaching what?
Pedophilia, pederasty, right here.
I've explained to you that this is done because we are talking about historical perspectives of how gender relations and different types of sexual orientations have existed in history.
This is not about something occurred and therefore we have to teach it. If that was the case, we'd be teaching all kinds of things. What it is about is normalizing every type of perversion. And I want people to realize here the implications of this. This is more than just confusing and perverting and sexualizing the children. Under California law, and this is the case in about half of the states now, and they're working on it at the federal law with the Equality Act, discrimination based on sexual orientation is illegal. So if pedophilia is a sexual orientation, Do public schools now need to hire pedophiles so that we don't discriminate on their sexual orientation? Do churches need to hire pedophiles so that they don't discriminate based on sexual orientation to run their children's ministries?
And we've seen it, haven't we, Alex? That at American public libraries and in public schools, we're inviting transvestites to come to read to our kindergartners who actually have records, twice it happened in Houston, for having molested kids in the past.
You know, this was the inevitable result of this, right? And now in California's fake history textbooks, they're praising this LGBT superhero, Harvey Milk, for being, the first elected openly homosexual activist. Turns out that guy also had a history of raping underage boys, and it is rape, right? The children cannot consent. And some of them went on to kill themselves, and yet they've made him into a superhero in California's textbooks as part of this new law that mandates the positive presentation of homosexuals and their alleged contributions to history.
What they're going to have to do if they continue this, if this goes unchallenged, is they're going to have to teach children that to oppose the sexual advances of adults simply because they're adults is now a kind of bigotry and orientation phobia. That's the next logical thing, to convince kids that if they're not considering sex with older people, then they're being bigots. That's the only place we by definition have to go next.
So I wanted you to see that just last week, this is a news report in California. And you've heard the saying, as California goes, goes the rest of the nation. Folks, this is really huge. Every single one of us should be calling everybody on the list. If you need an online source, gone to, with the number 2, FAR.org, has the whole thing laid out there for you. You can click on who to call. Right there will bring up the entire list of the people, both Republican and Democrats, that are on the judicial committee and a civil rights committee concerning this issue of H.R. 5. It's a resolution they want to attach to the 1964 Civil Rights Bill, and which it was amended in 68 and 69, which would actually bring in, and I know this is almost hard to believe, but even in the bill, they included the plus sign, which would be polyamorous, pansexuals, would be zoophilians, kinks, and these are the letters that actually the gay community, what?
Bestiality?
That's zoophilians, bestiality. So they soften it up, and like the APA wants to call it MAPS and YAPS, minor attractive people. That's what this is. Minor attractive people and YAPS are youth attractive people. So both orientations of prepubescent and post-pubescent are legitimate orientations. This is so perverted, it's off the rails. Okay, now just remember who I am. I'm somebody who came out of homosexuality 35 years ago. I have been watching people over the last 30 years of ministering, having watched souls being completely transformed by the Word of God and coming out of this stuff. This is not immutable. Since the 90s, you've heard the lie. People are born this way. People are born this way. The science is on our side. It's a lie from the pit of hell. So please take action. If you love your family, if you love your children, your grandchildren, you must act. Brother?
Thank you, Steve. We're just so blessed to have you here. I need to say, a few weeks ago, Bernie Sanders came and gave a little speech. Actually, we found out later it was a guy impersonating Bernie, but we didn't realize that. But it had such an impact on one of our members. He's become a comrade in the Soviet Union, and I thought I would have him come up here today, and he has decided that socialism really does work. And so he's wearing his hat just to advertise the fact, a comrade. And do you want to say anything to the group about socialism? Or?
Everything that you see on Fox News is a lie. There's nothing going on in Venezuela. It's a hoax. It's fake news. Socialism works. Thank you for this.
Well, we always like to hear both sides. the right side and the crazy side. Speaking of crazy, we have Chuck, no, excuse me. Our founder, our beloved founder, and President Emeritus Charlie Meadows would like to talk to us about political systems. So Charlie, if you would come up.
Go, Charlie.
Thank you. I'm a little bit saddened right now. I realized the first time I went to Lexington and Concord, I actually went to a bookstore in Concord and purchased a book that had the names and the locations and the town of where all the people lived at the time the shots were fired at the British. And unfortunately, Comrade Blood over here had 3 of his relatives on that bridge that day by the name of Blood, and I can see he's gone to the dark side now rather than holding up for what his ancestors have done. So, okay, on with my rant here. Last week we had Americans for Prosperity here. I was very impressed with their presentation. I was very impressed with the quality of the young men. I've known John Tidwell for some time and Joey for a while. But the one gentleman next to the far left there, I was very impressed with him, but he said something, he used the word democracy, and it just grated upon me. And I want to tell you, as you know, I'm becoming more and more of a stickler on trying to get things right. Because when we're sloppy, we lose the battle.
That's right.
And here's why this is important in my estimation. How many of you think that there is a difference in the form of government between a democracy and a republic? Okay. Huge. When they came out of the convention, Constitutional Convention, and the woman approached Ben Franklin and said, "Well, sir, what is it? What do we have?" He said, "It's a democracy, ma'am, if you can keep it." And we ought to really think about, excuse me, a republic, ma'am, if you can keep it. Right. Just seeing if you're on your toes. We really should think about what he said, if you can keep it.
Right.
Now, I became aware some years ago that most people that live outside the United States, that have high admiration for the United States, believe that we are a democracy. I've also written in the past that many people that immigrate here, whether legally or illegally, and even the ones that become citizens and vote, don't always necessarily make the best citizens. They may be wonderful people, might be a great neighbor, might be a really good co-worker, but as far as understanding the principles of good government and the ideas of our founding fathers, few of them, it's not required in their citizenship thing, few of them really have delved into that deep enough to understand. Just like most of our kids growing up today have no knowledge of that either, which kind of has us floating adrift in the ocean now, not knowing what our heritage was. But this is why it's really important we get this right. Democracy is government according to the majority at any given point in time. And on one day, the majority might feel one way. On another day, maybe just a week later, through manipulation and things, that majority could be shifted to a different opinion. So do you see why democracies can be very unstable? We also saw an instance in history where 2 men were on trial, and the judge announced to the people out here, he said, "I'm going to give you an opportunity to set one of these 2 men free." Now, one of them was obviously a criminal, and the other one was obviously innocent. But there were some manipulators out in the crowd, and they began to stir the crowd out to call for the obvious criminal to be set free. And of course, that was the trial of Jesus that I'm referring to. Now, don't misunderstand me. Jesus had to go to the cross. I understand that. Not making anything. I'm just trying to point out the dangers of a democracy. Now, a number of years ago, Mary Fallon, lieutenant governor at the time, maybe she was governor, I don't know, was at an OCPA convention, I believe, and was asked to come up and do the Pledge of Allegiance. And she was doing a little setup speech and talked about our democracy. And so when she started the pledge, I started off saying, I pledge allegiance to the Republic of the United States of America. Oh, excuse me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the democracy for which it stands. Well, I said that word a little bit louder than I meant to, and everybody started turning and looking at me. I was trying to make a point there. That doesn't even, the flag doesn't even stand for democracy. It stands for government according to the rule of law. And our founders didn't even set this government up to be governed by democracy. There are parts of it we were to service through the democratic process, but other parts were not even to be serviced through the democratic process. I'm going to wrap this up with this. A number of years ago, my wife and I were in Ardmore at a restaurant called Two Frogs. And we had a very attractive young lady come up as our waitress. And she announced her name was Olga. And so I said, well, Olga, I said, are you from Russia? And she said, no, I'm from Bloodsville. I'm from Bloodsville, Ukraine. Sorry, Kim Blood. And I said, well, now Ukraine and Soviet Union or Russia are very different. She said, yes, they are. And I began to talk to her and found out she was a student at East Central over in Ada, and she was working on business administration. And she wanted an MBA there. And we just talked more and more. And so finally, I got down to this with her. I said, you know, Olga, in their two farthest extremes, there's really only two kinds of government. There's a lot of names we have for government, and they're just variations of these two extremes. And these two extremes come down to this. You're either going to have a government that respects your liberty and protects your private property, or it's going to be a government that abuses your liberty and consumes your private property. I said, Olga, which of the two governments would you prefer? Oh, I'd much rather have the one that respects your liberty and protects your private property. And I said, well, Olga, if you were to go to Economics 101, we would understand that every form of government, every economic system is a capitalist system. Again, just like this restaurant, Olga, there's a grill back there in the back. That's a capital good. That grill makes fried chicken and hamburgers and things like that. Those are consumer goods. So Olga, the real contest between East and West has never been about capitalism versus communism. It's about who's going to own and control the capital goods, the means of production of goods and services. Is it going to be the government or is it going to be the individual? And her eyes, she's lighting up. She's getting it. I said, okay, now there's two major political parties. Which of those two do you think best represents the one that protects your liberty, respects your liberty and consumes your private, respects your liberty and protects your private property versus the other one? And she said, the Democrat Party. Now, folks, I've done this many times, and almost all foreigners will pick that one.
Is that right? Sure.
Almost all of them will.
Wow.
You see what being sloppy with our terminology produces? You see why it's important? So when you encounter your kids and your neighbors and others, you might ask them, well, in your opinion, what is the difference between democracy and a republic? What is that difference? And I hope you're able to explain it. One is government according to the rule of law. And by the way, a republic by its own nature is not necessarily good. The old Soviet Union was called the USSR, Union of Soviet Socialistic Republics. Ours is different than any other in the world in the past, because ours was based upon God's Word.
That's right.
And that's a big difference. So, thank you.
Yeah, and it sure doesn't help when every American president, I think, refers to us, would this be true, they generally refer to us as democracies?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure when I've heard a guy say, hey, we're a republic, not a democracy. I'm not sure, I think George Washington would have said that, but I'm not sure I've, in my lifetime, ever heard a president make that distinction, but they all say we're
Dick
democracy.
Cheney used to call us a republic pretty often when he was vice president or
Okay.
running for it.
Dick Cheney,
Yeah.
our vice president.
I mean, I didn't trust anything he said, but he used to use the right word.
Okay. Yeah, just for the camera, he didn't trust anything he said, but he did use the right word for it. And of course, in our government schools, now for over 100 years, many generations, yeah, we're taught, yeah, we're a democracy. And I'm getting ready possibly to go to I was going to say my 50th high school class reunion, but had I said that, you would have known how old I was. And so I'm realizing it might not be the 50th, it maybe it's only the 30th, come to think of it. And I'm sure everybody there thinks we're in a democracy. Well, we're already cutting into the time of our guest speaker, who I'm just excited to have. My wife and I had the privilege of sitting down. We were at a Chris Ann banquet for certain VIPs, I guess, and so we were in a room there, and there were a number of tables. We had the privilege of sitting at the table with all the professors, and Dr. James Crowder was one. There were a number, and it was just it was a robust conversation. We were the loudest table in the room. Everybody wished they were at our table, and these guys were just real cut-ups. So I've been wanting to get Dr. Crowder for some time. He won't respond to my emails, won't answer my phone calls, but I caught him at the Republican convention, and he was sneaking, not in front of, but behind the OPAC table. I guess he thought I wouldn't see him, and I caught him, and so he agreed to come. And I'm just delighted to have him here, and I think he's probably happy to be here. But Dr. James Crowder, and let's give an OPAC welcome to Dr. James Crowder.
It's there. It's just minimized.
Okay, let's see.
Is this the right height?
Would someone like to sing while we're adjusting the visit? Oh, here's Charlie.
The reason I said what I said about Dick Cheney is I saw him making a speech at the Council on Foreign Relations one time, and he said, it's really good to be back with you guys. I've been a member for a long time. That's not something I ever told or wanted any of my constituents in Wyoming to know. That's why I said what I said about Dick Cheney. But he did use the right verbiage.
Charlie,
Yes.
you got a lot of mileage out of that when I was a coordinator in Wyoming for 18 months.
I bet you did. That's right.
Everybody's heard that one.
By the way, I hope if there's any millennials in the crowd, we want to apologize for the gentleman wearing the Make America Great hat again. I don't think I see any millennials, so I think you're okay. I told him he should walk. I said I'd be happy to walk on the OU campus with you wearing that hat because I'm told they break out in hives. So I appreciate you wearing that hat today. We should sell those.
Okay, I think we're ready to start now. Appreciate it. I'm totally intimidated by all the wisdom in this room, and so I'm going to just approach it with the same feeling I have. Years ago, I went to John Adams Library in Quincy, Massachusetts, and if you walk into his library next to the mansion, it's just, of course, it's just huge books, but everywhere, and the floor is magnificent. It's blue and white tile, and it looks like a miniature quilt. It's just floor, just takes up the whole floor. Right at the front door, all the tile is messed up. It doesn't fit the pattern at all. And President Adams did that on purpose, so every morning when he went in, he would remember, nobody's perfect, only God is perfect. Wow. So I may mess this up today, and you think about that.
Okay.
I think everybody knows that we consider history as educational, but I think that it can also be entertaining and edifying. And the topic today we're going to talk about, the key event happened in 1929, but to really understand that, we need to go back several years and understand the world that they were living in at the time. going to have trouble with that, I can tell. We all know that Oklahoma became our 46th state in 1907. However, these earlier events played into making the story we're going to talk about today more relevant to us. Now, the United States was experiencing a period that we call the populist or progressive era. And a lot of times people use those terms interchangeably, but they're really quite different. A populist is a person who believes that the common man has the integrity and ability to operate government. Now, in other words, you would make a good governor if you're honest and have integrity. You don't need to go to MIT or Harvard. Everybody that's honest would make a good governor. Meanwhile, the progressive believes that rapid change is important. In fact, they probably believe that any change means progress and means improvement. This populist progressive era was primarily an agrarian situation that was first noted in 1892 election, 96, 1912, and then it became kind of an urban issue in the elections of 24 and 48. Now, both populists and progressives, even though they're different, they agree on one thing, that most of the ills of society are the result of elitism, greed, and hypocrisy. And wherever power is centralized, corruption naturally follows. Or as Lord Acton famously said, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Therefore, to disrupt abusive power, the sources of power must be divided among organizations, in organizations, and among organizations. As the Jeffersonian admonition was, let the people rule, not the tyrants of kings, governments, businesses, or bureaucracies. When Oklahoma's Constitutional Convention convened in Guthrie in November of 1906, elected members created a document that clearly was a reaction to this world that they saw. They were primarily led by Chickasaw Nation delegate William Alfalfa Bill Murray and other participants who had been active in the proposed state of Sequoia just 2 years earlier. When they completed this document, to disrupt power from being in one place, it was 50,000 words. It was the longest constitution that had ever been written in the history of the world. Now, compare that with the U.S. Constitution, which was less than 1/10 the length, and those ancient words of the Ten Commandments that took only 300 words. But Oklahoma needed 50,000.
Wow.
However, one similarity that the founding fathers of the Oklahoma Constitution had with the U.S. Constitution was the belief that the separation of powers between the executive, judicial, and legislative branches should not be equal. Both groups of founding fathers believed that the legislature was the beacon of representative democracy. It should be supreme, and the judicial and executive branches would only enforce what the legislative branch deemed appropriate. Additionally, citizens could make government more responsive with direct democracy, which included initiative, referendum, and recall positions, and the removal of any elected official through impeachment. Accordingly, it's no surprise that when the first legislature met in late 1907, Alfalfa Bill Murray engineered his position where he knew the most power resided in Oklahoma, the Speaker of the House. His cohort in both the Sequoia and Guthrie conventions, Charles Haskell, played his cards right and saw his calling as the governor, and he took the governor's chair as the second most important part of Oklahoma. The following year, when the National Democratic Party met in Denver and nominated William Jennings Bryan as their standard bearer for the third time, the Oklahoma delegation took over the writing, rules, and platform committee and created a progressive document just like the one they had left in Guthrie. A writer for the Denver Post said, "The Oklahomans, fresh from adopting a constitution that is most radical of any state in the Union, practically controlled this convention." And he was right. Now, an important part of the Oklahoma Constitution is Section 8, which deals with officers subject to impeachment. It reads in part, "The governor and other elected officers, including justices of the Supreme Court, shall be liable and subject to impeachment for willful neglect of duty, corruption in office, habitual drunkenness, incompetency, or any offense involving moral turpitude committed while in office." Impeachment, you see, was not viewed as the last resort to prevent the fall of representative democracy or when all other attempts to curtail abusive power had failed, but was really a tool to use if they deemed that the people's purposes were being blocked by an institution. During the first 2 decades of the statehood of Oklahoma, it was used numerous times, and the threat of impeachment was as commonplace as overhanging clouds. Now, as a quick aside, impeachment is bringing formal charges by the House of Representatives. It is not the removal of office by the Senate. In other words, in the national arena, both Presidents Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton were impeached. They simply were not removed from office by the Senate. After the 1912 elections in Oklahoma, which many considered a let's clean house election, every single state elected official in the executive branch, and there were 17, was impeached, was investigated, and 3 of them were impeached. Oklahoma's second governor was Lee Cruz. He was one of those impeached, but the Senate found him not guilty by 1 single vote. Now, in truth, Cruz was a bit of a killjoy and properly labeled a penny-pinching, buttermilk-drinking, anti-gambling prude. Not surprisingly, he made a lot of people angry when he called out the state militia in 1914 to stop the sin of gambling at the Tulsa Jockey Club. Now, in 1923, the State House impeached John Walton, known as Our Man Jack, with 22 charges, including padding the public payroll, accepting illegal campaign funds, the suspension of habeas corpus, and general incompetency. With the Chief Justice of Oklahoma presiding, the state Senate found Walton guilty on 11 counts and removed him from office. Lieutenant Governor Martin Trapp became the state's 6th governor and served out the remaining 3 years and 1 month of Walton's term. Interestingly, Trapp had himself been impeached 2 years earlier, but was not found guilty. The next governor's election happened in 1926 with Henry Johnson winning the race, who we will talk about today, but ultimately facing the same results as did Governor Walton. Now, if you were apt to brag on anything, you might brag on the fact that Oklahoma is the only state to impeach and remove from office 2 governors in a row. But first, let me put to rest any myth you might have heard, which was, I first heard it in junior high civics class, in that if Oklahoma impeached and removed 3 governors, it would go back to being a territory. Now, that story was put out by none other than Alfalfa Bill Murray himself, who was threatened with impeachment constantly. And he thought that was a good idea on his part. Of course, nothing like that could ever happen, even if it had been part of Oklahoma's Organic Act of 1890 or the State Enabling Act of 1916. That was all put to rest in 1911 by the U.S. Supreme Court in a case called Coyle versus Smith, which said once a state is a state, it's equal to any other state. In other words, whatever a state does, it couldn't go back to being a territory. Now let's look specifically at Henry Johnson and try to answer the question, how did he get himself into such a pickle? Johnson was born in a log cabin near Evansville, Illinois, take that back, Indiana, in December of 1867. He moved with his parents as a young boy to southeast Kansas, attended public schools in Neosho County, and then went to Baker University, Methodist College, southwest of Kansas City, where he earned his degree in 1890. Now, he developed a keen interest in law, and he moved to Denver, studied law privately, and was able to pass the bar and start practice in Denver. When the Cherokee Outlet was opened for settlement in 1893, Johnson was tempted to try out the new territory, but the thought of a thundering throng of man and beast was too rowdy for his temperament. And so he waited a week, and then when the dust had settled, he moved to Perry and hung out his shingle. As a young lawyer, he took an active part in civic affairs and served as appointed member of the Legislative Council for the territory. And then in 1901, he jumped into the political arena and was elected first of 2 terms as county attorney for Noble County, despite the fact that he was a Democrat in a Republican region. Not surprisingly, he then won an election as a delegate to the Oklahoma Constitutional Convention. Held in Guthrie, and he held important positions up there. He was head of the organizing committee. He was also vice presiding officer of the committee and temporary vice president of the convention. He formed strong alliances with Bill Murray and Charles Haskell at the time, and at one point Mr. Johnson donated $310 to keep the convention going when it had run out of money. Johnson is credited with being the author of the part of the Oklahoma Constitution that deals with initiative and referendum petitions. So the next time you go in and vote for state questions, you can thank Governor Johnson for that. When the first elections were held for all state offices in Oklahoma, Johnson was elected to the state Senate, and he was elected by his other rookie senators as the first President Pro Tem of the upper chamber in Oklahoma. The next year, in 1908, he ran for the U.S. House of Representatives and lost to Republican Byrd McGuire from Tulsa's 1st District. And then in 14, he ran again for a U.S. House of Representatives, and this time lost to Dick Morgan in the 8th District. However, all was not lost during this period. In 1910, he married Ethel Littleton, who was a young stenographer at the Guthrie Convention that he met there. And even though he was twice her age at the time of the wedding, that marriage lasted the next 55 years. They adopted 4 daughters and raised those 4 girls. Now, Johnson was, to his admirers, slim, dapper, respectable man who seemed at home in a 3-piece wool suit. They had assumed that he slept in it. But to his critics, he was considered reedy, raspy, and overly pious. Now, it might be hard for us to see how this sophisticated dude could be elected or reach out to the common man of Oklahoma, but he had paid his dues to the party and worked his way where everybody knew him. Probably the thing that helped him most, he was Grand Master of the Oklahoma Masons and went all over the state speaking for them, and so people actually knew him. In 1926, he was able to win the Democratic primary with 37% of the vote, and in that period of time, we did not have a runoff, So he was the nominee, and then he went on the general election to beat the Republican, who was the postmaster of Tulsa. Johnson became Oklahoma's 7th governor in January of 1927 and would serve a little more than half his term. His inauguration was the first to be broadcast over radio, the first to use loudspeakers, and the first to include a prayer in the inauguration. In the beginning, things seems to be going well. The legislature passed and the governor signed into office a new $4.5 million for a common school education. They even funded an Oklahoma Crippled Children's Hospital and provided money for building the governor's mansion east of the Capitol building. The Johnsons would be the first family in the governor's mansion, but would reside there only 4 months. Now, beneath the government progress was a turbulent undertow of enmity, animosity, and jealousy. The first major flap came when Governor Johnson wanted to appoint all his friends to the Oklahoma Highway Commission. Can you imagine there being corruption in the Oklahoma Highway Commission? His idea was, I could appoint anybody I want to in the executive branch and nobody should say anything. What he should have done was gone to the state senators and asked for their input, worked with them, gotten their suggestions, or at least their approval on issues. But Johnson believed he could do everything he wanted to in the executive branch, and if he couldn't oust somebody in this commission, he appointed a new commission and just sent policy around the old one. That proved to be poor government and worse politics. However, nothing he did reach the animosity or as much fury as caused when he appointed Mrs. Mamie Scott Hammonds as his private secretary. She was the first woman to hold such a key position, and legislative leaders complained that she held the keys to the governor, and wouldn't let them have access to him at all. It was not a compliment when contemporaries of that era called her Oklahoma's first woman governor. At first blush, what she did may not have seemed any more outlandish than what Florence Henderson did, or Nancy Reagan, or maybe even Kathy Keating. But it was her decision-making process that sent people into a feathered frenzy. Mamie Hammonds was a mystic. She consulted the stars to determine if they are aligned with the correct patterns for the governor's action. Although Johnson had a religious background and always salted his speeches with biblical references, he apparently chose to ignore Deuteronomy, the 8th chapter, which calls such practices an abomination. His New Age beliefs included astronomy, numerology, and animism. To some, he became a puppet tied to her unorthodox strings. When she pushed the governor to appoint her husband, O.O. Hammonds, as the state medical examiner, critics at least had to admit the fact that Dr. Hammonds had a medical degree. But when she called on her father, J.R. Armstrong, to make recommendations in the governor's inner circle, and he started working for the governor, her father, Mr. Armstrong, was an advanced mystic who could speak to spirits of superior intellect. These particular superior intellects resided in the form of yellow canaries, which were kept in a nearby cage in case of an important appointment or action by Governor Johnson had to be decided. It's not completely known to me whether the wise canaries spoke to him, sang to him, or left a specifically splattered pattern on the birdcage below. Simply put, Oklahoma's chief executive and representative people had to wait until he heard the canaries before he made any decisions. Such a step was not in the chart on how a bill becomes law in my high school textbook.
Wow.
Legislative leaders from both chambers joined in the condemnation of Mrs. Hammonds, and the chief antagonists were known as the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. And they were House members from McAllister, Claremore, Antlers, and Oklahoma City. Also among the leaders against the governor were the former chairman of the State Democratic Party, the former chaplain of the State Senate, and the former superintendent of public schools. And the anti-Johnson coalition tried to call a special session of the legislature together. First at the Capitol building, later at the Huggins Hotel. But according to the Constitution, only the governor can call a special session. And so Johnson viewed their actions as open rebellion or a coup d'etat. The sessionists talked with Johnson and tried to work out a compromise and said, we will back off from trying to oust you if you will simply get rid of Mrs. Hammonds. In 1927, a newspaper reporter asked Governor Johnson if he would sacrifice Hammonds to avoid the impeachment, and he responded, it would be yellow. It would be hiding behind the skirts of a woman. It would be base and venal to discharge Mrs. Hammonds under fire and false charges. If you come to me with 1,000 sheep and I have only one ewe lamb and you want me to destroy that, do you think I would destroy it? And it was then that he made his famous quote, must I give up this one little ewe lamb to satisfy your hunger? Well, what was he talking about? And if you didn't know what he was talking about, you wouldn't know what he was talking about. Of course, he was referring to 2 Samuel, the 12th chapter, when the prophet Nathan went before King David and talked to him about his committing adultery with Bathsheba, even though that King David had multiple wives and concubines at the time. Nathan told him the story of the poor man who had one little ewe lamb that he cared for and protected like his own child. And when the rich man decided to have a feast, he told his servants to go kill the poor man's little lamb and leave his vast herds alone. And after Nathan told David this story, the king was so outraged, he said, who is this person that I can bring into justice? And Nathan calmly said, thou art the man. And in this case, Mrs. Hammonds was the ewe lamb. Now, unlike now when political news moves rapidly from one point to the other and a national topic can pop up overnight, Oklahoma's struggle was pretty much within the borders of our state until Aldrich Blake, a member of Governor Walter's administration, had his article on Governor Johnson and Mrs. Hammonds published in the widely read Nation magazine. And then Oklahoma became a point of ridicule. In the meantime, Governor Johnson still had his supporters in the state legislature and in the Supreme Court declaring that the House of Representatives had no legal authority to call itself together. Johnson told the legislatures, you have a right to meet as citizens, but not as legislative bodies. Nevertheless, the Senate organized itself into a court of impeachment and called on the Chief Justice of the Oklahoma Supreme Court to swear them in. Chief Justice, of course, refused, so they had the Senate clerk swear them in. Then they asked the Attorney General for guidance. He says, I can't touch it because the Supreme Court has already ruled. But the House went ahead, appointed 52 of its members as an investigating body, and moved forward with the impeachment. Governor Johnson called out the state militia, sent 70 militiamen to the 4th floor of the Capitol building to prevent the men from gathering.
Wow.
During working hours. So they just met long before the Capitol opened the next morning. They voted 49-6 on the illegal use of the state militia and 45-10 on the charge of general incompetency. Johnson had already learned that the Senate was not ready to go beyond the Supreme Court ruling, and so he pulled back all the troops so the Senate would meet, and they voted 22-16 that the House of Representatives had gone beyond their constitutional ability. So what could the legislature do? They now saw that they had to wait till the 28 elections were over and they could convene again in January of 29. Now the 28 national election was very unique all across the United States because even pious Democrats voted for Herbert Hoover because their own standard bearer was Al Smith, the Roman Catholic. Oklahoma was a strong Democratic state, but that year the party only carried 8 counties. In fact, the Democratic leader Pushma Taha County boasted, "We have more vegetarians in the county than Republicans." And they still lost. They still lost the county. In fact, the Republicans made great gains in the state Senate and nearly captured the state House. So January 29 comes around, it's a new legislature, very different from the old one, but one thing they had in common was the idea to get rid of Johnson. On January 21st, 29, they brought 11 charges against the governor and impeached him. The Senate took 2 months, the following 2 months, to hear evidence from 141 witnesses and over 5,000 pages of written transcript. Finally, the Senate only found him guilty on one charge, that of being incompetent. The vote was 35-7. After his ouster, Johnson said, "I have lost the office of governor, but I have retained my honor and integrity. I retire with a clear conscience. I retain the public trust." When he went home to Perry, over 2,000 of his local citizens were there to greet him, and he resumed his work as an attorney and loyal Democrat. He ran for the Senate, U.S. Senate in 1930, but came in third in the primary. And then in 1932, he was a delegate to the National Democratic Convention, and he was the one that put Alfalfa Bill Murray's name forward for the presidential nomination. The same year, in 1932, he ran for the state Senate again and was elected for another 4-year term. After 1936, he went back to his life as an attorney in Noble County. And he was still practicing law up until the age 94, even driving to Oklahoma City on I-35 to file briefs when necessary. He died at age 97 and is buried alongside his wife at the Perry Cemetery. Now, as a quick aside, this picture came off Find a Grave. There is no reason why, I have no reason to believe there's any connection between the Confederate flag and the state flag in Mississippi. It's there, and somebody just had to do that, I guess. A little is known of the Hammonds after the impeachment process, other than the fact that Mrs. Hammond believed that her job was with the governorship and not Governor Johnson, and she wouldn't give up her post and had to be physically escorted out of the Capitol building. But Dr. Hammonds died in 1949 and Mrs. Hammonds in 62, and they're both buried in DeQueen County, Arkansas. Now, I will entertain questions from you, and if you have to go, that's fine, but I have 2 questions for you right now. Number 1, what is incompetency? You ever heard anybody say Trump is crazy? Have you ever heard anybody say Obama is nuts? Yeah. So you kind of get the point. Is Oklahoma ready for self-government?
What do they say?
Boy, I appreciate that. Because of the time, we're over time, so these people are all busy executives who have to go back to their offices. Actually, I don't think any of us have a thing to do the rest of the day, but I think we're going to close down, except for Stephen Black, who's, I know, busy. But I'm going to let you ask questions privately after the meeting. Comrade, you can come ask your questions, and we're going to need to close down. But let's give Dr. James Pratt another applause. Very well done. Next week, Judge Bill Graves is coming, and what a privilege to have had him for an Oklahoma judge for all these years. And if you have his book, Prudent Jurisprudence, bring it and he'll sign it. And I don't know that we're going to have copies available, but if we can get a hold of some, we will. But we ask you to just order them from Amazon. So just go to Amazon and order those. Again, would encourage you to go to the AFR website and say something about Walmart. The form will be there. Go to Kendra Horns. Go to our email, or just you can find Kendra's contact information and just call into her office and ask her, please reconsider what you're doing with House Bill 5. So with that, if you're not a member of OACPAC, it is the one sin you can fix today for $50. You can see Susan, give her your $50 and be a member of OACPAC and really feel squeaky clean about yourself. So we're going to close. Mike Sawyer, could you trot up here to the microphone? And we're going to close. And again, I'm just appreciative of Dr. Crowder, and I hope we can get some more of his ilk up here to talk about some Oklahoma history. I had no idea we had parakeets running the state for a period of time. That explains a lot.
Canaries.
Sometimes I think we'd be better off with the birds doing it. It's fascinating to find out just how screwed up this state is. Anyway, let's pray. Heavenly Father, we do thank you again for this meeting. Lord, we thank you for this history lesson. And Father, we pray that we would be mindful of the people that we put in office.
Yes, Lord.
Lord, that we would be mindful of your principles before we pull a lever. Father, please watch over us, and we just thank you for these things in Jesus' name.
Explain that.
know, and if you've got powerful people behind you, they'll turn a blind eye. Yeah, that's right.
Formulate that, sell that.
Well, they have once they can receive that truth, that there's a creator and a God, then you can make the way to that the sexuality is sinful and broken. You really can't see any adjustment until a person really, I mean, from my perspective, it really is soul converting. The mind, the will, and the emotions that actually start to change. It doesn't start to change until a person really, it really is.